Little Follies begins. The image on the cover of the latest edition of Little Follies is a detail from Claude Monet's The Harbor at Trouville, painted in 1870. This is the book's dedication, and really the dedication for the entire work, the entire personal history, for Mad. Shed thy fair beams into my feeble eyes, and raise my thoughts, too humble and too vile. It comes from Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queene, the prologue to Book 1. Because my novel contains Peter Leroy's memoir, he gets a cover illustration too. The image for his memoir is a detail from John William Waterhouse's Hylas and the Nymphs, painted in 1896. Little Follies, My Mother Takes a Tumble. The preface begins, and it begins with an epigraph from Dickens's David Copperfield. I think the memory of most of us can go farther back than many of us suppose, just as I believe the power of observation in numbers of very young children to be quite wonderful for its closeness and accuracy. Indeed, I think that most grown men who are remarkable in this respect may with greater propriety be said not to have lost the faculty than to have acquired it. I generally observe such men to retain a certain freshness and gentleness and capacity of being pleased, which are also an inheritance they've preserved from their childhood. Preface. Within a family, some events that an outsider might consider important are allowed to pass almost unnoticed and are soon forgotten. Yet others, which seem trivial to the world at large, may be elevated to positions of such eminence that they acquire the status of milestones. In my family, for example, no one remembers my birthday, but they all remember the day my mother tumbled from her lawn chair. In the years that followed her tumble, if talk around the dinner table turned to Mr. Beaker, a former neighbor, my mother would often ask, wistfully, I thought, "Do you remember the night he threw his desk lamp through the window? When was that?" Someone else, usually my grandmother, would answer, "Why, Ella, don't you remember? It was the night before the day you fell out of your lawn chair." It's comforting, when I feel a bit lost, to be able to put my feet up, close my eyes, and look back, as it were, along the road that I followed from wherever I once was to wherever I may be now, to retrace my steps and find, along that roadside, familiar milestones. Not only am I often a bit lost when I begin such a backward ramble, but I'm often lost during it as well, wandering on someone else's road or backing out of a cul-de-sac. And it's always a great relief to come upon one of these milestones, or if you prefer, landmarks. It is a particularly great relief if I stumble upon the milestone that marks the day that for the rest of my family came to be known as the day Ella tumbled from her lawn chair, and is on the map of my childhood memory labeled the day I was chasing kittens. For it is from that day that I date all the rest. However, I began writing My Mother Takes a Tumble not with the aim of commemorating that event, but to find a woman for Mr. Beaker. When I was a child on Knowbridge Road living with my parents in my grandparents' house, Mr. Beaker lived next door alone. I knew very little about him, and as far as I can recall, I never set foot inside his house. He visited my grandparents from time to time, and he always stayed just a little too long. He worked for the Babington Clam Council, writing advertisements. Later, I think he became president of the council. I'm not certain. He considered himself a fine craftsman with an uncanny knack of echoing in each of his advertisements the tone, style, and yearnings of potential clam consumers. Mr. Beaker relished his work and labored at it longer and harder than was really necessary, often working at home well into the night when there were fewer distractions and his unseen audience seemed to draw in around him like a group around a campfire and lean forward, waiting for him to spin a yarn about the succulent mollusk. Between his house and my grandparents grew a young oak that never fully lost its leaves until the very end of winter. When Mr. Beaker was at work at night, when I was in my crib, the light from his desk lamp would throw the shadows of its branches across my crib, across my parents' bed, and onto the opposite wall, where a door opened into a hall that led into the living room, where Gumma and Guppa and my parents sat listening to the radio or talking, quietly and uneasily, for living together was difficult for all of them. Whenever Mr. Beaker was visiting and the time had come for him to go home, his face would grow long and dark, and he would begin praising my grandmother's cooking and my mother's figure. "Dudley," my father would say after he had left, "needs a woman." Years later, I was walking along one fall day and smelled the unmistakable odor of burning leaves. It brought to mind, for reasons I'll explain shortly, the years I spent on No Bridge Road and Mr. Beaker and all the rest, ending with my father saying, "Dudley needs a woman." I realized that my father had been right, and that Mr. Beaker had thrown his desk lamp through the window that night because he was alone and hated it. So I created Eliza Foote, arranged a meeting, and let events take their natural course. I think some readers will be interested in knowing the sources of one or two other fabricated details. My grandfather, Guppa, is a Studebaker salesman in My Mother Takes a Tumble. In fact, he was not. Making him a Studebaker salesman was, I admit, simply an easy way out of a difficult situation. Let me explain. The smell of burning leaves made me recall my years on No Bridge Road because it brought to mind quite clearly a fall ritual that began with the raking and burning of leaves. As if in response to some silent bell, men up and down No Bridge Road would rise from their breakfasts one fall Saturday, pull on old sweaters, step outside with rakes in their hands, and begin raking leaves into enormous piles on their lawns. Then the children of the neighborhood would jump into these huge piles, run through them, and scatter them. At that time, any decent leaf pile came up to my waist, and in some I could get buried up to my armpits. But today, I'm hard-pressed to accumulate a pile that reaches to my knees. Either there are fewer leaves now than there were then, or the art of piling leaves has decayed. The men would rake the leaves into piles again and then begin carrying them to the street. They would make a number of small piles in the street, in the gutter, which was merely a shallow valley at the margin of the roadway, not defined by a curbstone, and burn them, one pile at a time. Up and down No Bridge Road, men would lean on rakes and watch their leaves burn. The burning of leaves was followed by the second part of the ritual, the crushing of shells. Everyone on No Bridge Road had a clamshell driveway. Many people in Babington still have clamshell driveways, but they're not so widely favored now as they once were. They were cheap and serviceable, and required little maintenance other than a yearly addition of new shells to replace the bits of crushed shell that had been carried away by the wheels of cars and bicycles, or the soles of the mailman's, milkman's, and breadman's shoes, or washed into the gutter in rainstorms. The men would drag out burlap sacks of clamshells that had accumulated since the last fall and dump them onto their driveways. The children would pick through the shells and set aside a few of the shapeliest, the most clamshell-like. These paragons would be used for ashtrays or made into knickknacks. The others, the not quite right, the deformed and broken, the men would spread up and down the driveways. Then, and at last we near the point of this reminiscence, they would drive their cars up and down the driveways to crush the shells. So vividly did the smell of leaf smoke return the memory of those fall days to me that I could see all the men driving up and down their driveways and hear the clamshells crushing under their wheels. Quite suddenly, I realized something that had never struck me when I witnessed this scene as a child. All the men were driving Studebakers. I looked more closely, straining to see all the way to the corner. There was no doubt about it. Every car on No Bridge Road was a Studebaker. This put me into quite a tizzy because I knew that if I included this remarkable fact without explanation, the reader would regard it as gratuitously absurd. So to make it plausible, I made Guppa a Studebaker salesman, and a very good one, although in fact, he was a foreman in the culling section of the clam packing plant. In the barroom scene, I have repeated the word barroom far too often, I know. I have no excuse. I repeated the word simply because I enjoy coming upon it when I read, for I can't help reading it, no matter how strong the context, as the word my childhood chum Rascal used to imitate the sound of a mighty explosion. Boy, you should have seen it when old Round-ass's clam boat got hit by lightning. He's right in the middle of the bay, minding his own business, taking a break to wipe his sweaty brow and thinking that maybe he'll eat a sandwich, when suddenly there's a big flash of light and then boom! One more point. In My Mother Takes a Tumble, all the houses on No Bridge Road are stucco. That is, they're faced with stucco. Such houses are in Babington called simply stucco instead of faced with stucco. That was not actually the case. All the houses on the north side of No Bridge Road were stucco, but on the south side was a hodgepodge of small vacation houses and shacks, unevenly spaced and poorly painted, with no garages and, as I recall, no Studebakers, despite the efforts of my grandfather. I omitted any mention of the differences between the two sides of the street because I knew that if I mentioned the difference, I'd have to explain it, since if I didn't explain it, many readers would consider my not explaining it significant, nodding knowingly and saying to themselves sardonically, as Porky White did when I tried it out on him, I see what this is. It's all class differences. Peter is born into the tight-assed and striving lower middle class, a class that literally lives behind a thin and fragile facade, stucco. He put his fork down and took a swallow of coffee. You know, he said, the lower middle class is very interesting. This facade they work so hard to erect and maintain is, well, it's like the frosting on this cake. He poked with his fork at the slice of cake I'd given him. It's pretty white frosting, but it has no real flavor. It's just sweet. The good part of the cake, in fact, the essence of cakeness, is the cake itself. Its texture, its chocolatey good flavor, even its shape. So the people in the class into which you were born, to sum up, were hiding their true vital essence, their essential vitality, behind a sort of icing. Ah, He waved his fork at me. But across the street, your young self sees and maybe yearns to join the haphazard, sweaty, lusty, and fundamentally richer life of the unfrosted, sometimes working class, right? Peter Leroy, Smalls Island, April 2nd, 1982. Chapter 1 begins. Mr. Beaker lived alone in a stucco house next door to Gumma and Guppa, my mother's parents, on No Bridge Road. There was, as a sign on the corner cautioned, no bridge at the end of No Bridge Road, though one had once been planned and rumors persisted that construction would begin soon. All the houses on No Bridge Road were stucco. Beside each house, on the right as he faced it, was a clamshell driveway that led to a stucco garage. Guppa, a salesman at Babington Studebaker who never took no for an answer, had seen to it that in each garage was a Studebaker. Under the right conditions, on a winter morning, when snow covered their roofs and glistened in the morning light, the houses looked like the chocolate cakes for which my mother was within her circle noted. Dark, rich, two-layer cakes covered with shiny white frosting that she pulled into peaks with the back of a spoon. My mother and father were living in Gumma and Guppa's house then. Gumma taught my mother how to pull the icing into peaks, and Mr. Beaker ate his share of those cakes at Sunday dinners. I first saw one on the day that my mother and I came home from the hospital in South Hargrove. My father swung Guppa's Studebaker into the driveway, crunching clamshells under the wheels. Gumma and Guppa ran from the house with Mr. Beaker right behind them. My father slid from behind the wheel and dashed to the rear door. Gumma and Guppa ran right up to the car, but Mr. Beaker held back a bit. My father opened the door with a flourish and held out his hand in a gesture usually accompanied by voila. Voila! Burst from Mr. Beaker. My father scowled at the driveway. Gumma and Guppa poked their heads into the car to get their first look at me in natural light. Beyond them, Mr. Beaker was bending this way and that, trying to get a glimpse between them. He was holding his hands behind him and wearing a grin of the sort that usually made Gumma, and later my mother, say, "You look like the cat that swallowed the canary." At last, Gumma and Guppa moved aside, and my father reached into the car to take me off my mother's hands. Seeing an opening, Mr. Beaker stepped up and produced from behind his back, with a flourish, one of the famous chocolate cakes, baked under Gumma's guidance as a birthday cake for me. Voila, muttered my father, twisting his foot in the shells. My mother blushed. "Isn't that nice?" she asked me. "Your first birthday cake." My father carried me very carefully into the house. Mr. Beaker helped my mother from the car. Mr. Beaker was said to have a college degree, and he may have had one, for A, he smoked a pipe, B, on weekends he wore loafers and a cardigan sweater with suede patches on the elbows, and C, at about the time that I learned to stand up in my crib, he began making a tidy living in a line of work that my father called, shaking his head in grudging admiration, a swindle that only a college man could have dreamed up. Writing letters as Mary Strong to lonely men who, from time to time, could be persuaded to send the unfortunate Miss Strong some money. Mr. Beaker drummed up business by running advertisements in the personals columns of small-town newspapers. He ran his first ad in the Hargrove Daily News just to test the waters. Lonely man, lovely young woman in unfortunate circumstances, wishes to correspond with lonely man. Mary Strong, Post Office Box 98, Babington, New York. At that time, Eliza Foote was living in Hargrove and working as a typist at Hackett and Belder Insurance, the premier firm of its type in Babington. Guppa recommended them so highly to purchasers of Studebakers that all the homes, lives, and automobiles on No Bridge Road were insured through them, and Mr. Hackett saw to it that Guppa had a steady supply of liquor and turkeys. When Eliza came home from work each evening, she read the daily news straight through while she sipped bourbon from a juice glass. Sometimes she read aloud so that her room would not seem so empty. Mr. Beaker's ad caught her eye just as she was swallowing the last little sip. She choked, gasped, and gasped again. For a moment, she saw Mary plainly, somewhere across town, maybe in one of the rooms at the River Sound Hotel, sitting at a table, sipping from a glass of bourbon, reading and rereading her ad, hoping that someone else was reading it too. Eliza began rummaging in her pocketbook for a pen, but after a few minutes she remembered that Mr. Hackett had borrowed her pen to print his name on the stub of a raffle ticket he'd bought from a pushy high school girl who just wouldn't take no for an answer, and rarely gave it either if Eliza didn't miss her guess. In a kitchen drawer she found a pencil, which she sharpened with a paring knife. She sat at her table and began to write, but she hated the way the pencil lead looked on the nice stationery her sister had sent her for Christmas. So she went next door to Mrs. Mitchell, who had to repair typewriters in her spare time to make ends meet, because Mr. Mitchell hadn't given much thought to death when he was alive and had left her ill provided for when he died, though God knows he'd sent enough money to that brother of his. Mrs. Mitchell was happy to lend her a typewriter after Eliza had given satisfactory answers to a few probing questions. Eliza wasn't the only person to answer Mr. Beaker's ad, but she was the first. She signed her letter John Simpson, approximating the name of Dan Hansen, the only unattached salesman at Hackett and Belder, a fellow who cut a dashing figure in his fedora and checked jacket and set Eliza's heart aflutter whenever he walked past her desk. On the morning that Mr. Beaker found Eliza's letter in his post office box, snow still covered Gumma and Guppa's lawn. I was sitting in a high chair in the kitchen, gumming a piece of toast, when Mr. Beaker let himself in through the back door, ending the conversation my mother and Gumma were having about the way I ate my toast. "You see," my mother was saying, "he doesn't like the dry part of the toast much. I think it's because it hurts his pink little gums and the roof of his little mouth. But he doesn't like the slobbered part much either. I think because it's revolting. So what he does is turn the toast as he eats it. See that?" Dudley says that my mother chewed on her lower lip a moment while she tried to remember just what it was that Mr. Beaker had said about the way I ate my toast. While she was ruminating, Mr. Beaker burst into the room. "Dudley," exclaimed my mother, breaking out in a smile, "I was just talking about you and what you said about the way Peter eats his toast. How does that go again?" Mr. Beaker was holding an envelope in front of him at arm's length, dangling it between two fingers as a boy might dangle a small fish, a killifish or a mummichog, say, that he'd caught with an old hook and a piece of bacon sitting on the bulkhead somewhere along the estuarial stretch of the Bolotomy River. He was wearing the same grin that he'd worn when he had stood at the end of the driveway with a chocolate cake behind his back. "It's something about nibbling at the elusive, ever-receding twilight line of this moment," ahead of which lies an abrasive future, and behind which we leave a messy past, isn't it? My mother asked. Yes, yes, something like that, Mr. Beaker answered impatiently. He waggled the envelope and cleared his throat. Gumma poured him a cup of coffee. Why, Dudley, said my mother, her mouth falling open and her eyebrows rising, why aren't you at work? Are you playing hooky? Ladies, Mr. Beaker said, flapping the envelope with great vigor, I have caught one. I have here a letter written by a shy insurance salesman in response to Mary Strong's advertisement. My new career is launched, and so is, he pulled the letter from the envelope, unfolded it, and read the signature, John Simpson's. He doesn't know it yet, but he is going to become the first of Mary Strong's epistolary sugar daddies. I have quit my job. Gumma's face fell. You quit your job? She asked. Yes, indeed. He adopted a conspiratorial tone and put his arm around Gumma's shoulders. To tell the truth, I never liked that job. Every morning I would sit at my desk and ask myself, Dudley, is writing advertisements for clams suitable work for an educated man? A man with imagination and taste? A man who can be struck dumb by a sunrise, transfixed by a hawthorn abloom in the spring, choked up by Venus gleaming beside the moon on a winter night? I tried holding my toast by 2 fingers, as Mr. Beaker had held his letter, and flapping it with great vigor, but it got away from me and fell to the floor. Mr. Beaker picked it up and put it on my tray. I looked at it. Some cat hairs and a little fluff ball were stuck to it. I tried to push it disdainfully just to one side of the tray. But in those days, there wasn't much subtlety in my vocabulary of gestures. The toast flew off the tray and fell to the floor again. Mr. Beaker picked the toast up and threw it into the trash. Do not play with your food, Peter, he said. I've always thought your ads were wonderful, my mother said. She was dunking one end of half a slice of toast into her coffee. Glistening discs of melted butter drifted and merged on the surface. She stared at a spot about midway between her and me, where her memory projected a retrospective show of Mr. Beaker's advertisements for the Babington Clam Council, each of which my mother had placed in an album that my father had given her, intending that she would use it for photographs of me. Clams, the chewy snack in the sturdy pack. Say, Mom, your family's counting on you. They're counting on you for something yum good at supper time, something that will make up for the drudgery of the workaday world of work and the failures of the school day world of school. Before you start frying that chicken, better stop a moment and think. Is the same old thing going to warm the cockles of their hearts? Or will you see long pusses all around the table wearing that chicken again look? Bring a little sunshine into their miserable lives. Serve Babington clams in chowder, steamed, baked, fried, or just as they are in their own handy shells. Look for them at your favorite store. The Babington Clam Council. Free recipe book, yours for the asking. Write Babington Clam Council, Babington, New York. They're real clever, she pronounced, the show complete. Really? Offered Mr. Beaker. Oh, yes, Dudley. I wouldn't lie to you, asserted my mother. If I thought they weren't any good, I'd tell you. That's the way I am. I just have to say what I think, even when I shouldn't. She's always been that way, said Gumma. She laughed a little and settled into her chair. She dunked her toast, and a reminiscent gaze formed over her eyes. I'll never forget the time when Billy Who's-Its father, what was his name, Ella? That Billy, what's his name? Not the one we call Billy Lardbottom, the fat boy whose father was a butcher? No, I mean that Billy whatchamacallit. I think his father was a handyman or a painter. He was very handsome, I remember, the father, I mean. Well, anyway, one day this Billy somebody or other's father was talking about something, what was it? He always talked as if he knew everything. And Ella suddenly said something like, "I'll have to hear it another time," said Mr. Beaker. He gave Gumma a kiss on her forehead. "I have a great deal to do." He gave my mother a kiss just to the side of her mouth. When Mr. Beaker got home, he dashed to the room that he'd outfitted for work, a room on the second floor, facing my grandparents' house, directly across from the room I shared with my mother and father, where I slept in the crib my mother once used. He read and reread John Simpson's letter until he could begin to hear John Simpson reading it to himself to see how it would sound to the lovely unfortunate. He wrote draft after draft, trying again and again to strike just the right note in his reply. He relished this work as he never had any other, and he labored at it long and hard, working on into the night, until he began to feel the distance between him and John Simpson shrink, and began to develop the trait that would make him so successful in this line of work: an uncanny knack for echoing in Mary Strong's replies to her many correspondents the tone, style, and yearnings of each of the men who wrote to her. The light from his desk lamp threw shadows of the branches of a young oak across my crib, across my parents' bed, and onto the opposite wall. Later, Mr. Beaker would become quite facile, a virtuoso of the heartstrings, especially adept at pizzicato, he liked to say. But his correspondence with Eliza Foote was difficult from start to finish. Chapter 2 begins. Dear Miss Strong, I can't begin to tell you how much your ad in the Hargrove Daily News moved me. I would like very much to correspond to you, for I understand your needs, as I too have needs that are, I'm sure, quite similar. Let me tell you something about myself. I am considered quite handsome and am in the peak of health and quite generously endowed and very virile. I find that I am shy with women because I think that I'm not what they are looking for, since I am a good and decent sort, and such men are not in demand so much as the other sort is, the fast and brassy sort, as I'm sure you know from bitter experience, no doubt. But you see, it all works out for the best, because here is a lonely guy who is shy and who wants to cheer you up. In your ad, you said, lovely young woman, or did you write lonely, and the Daily News made a mistake, as they so often do, not only in their spelling, but in their editorial positions, and printed lovely? Or maybe you are both, because a lovely woman can be lonely through no fault of her own, I know. I can imagine what you look like. I mean that I know what a lovely, lonely woman looks like. For example, the woman who waits for the bus to Babington each morning on the bench in front of Louise's coffee shop. On cold mornings, she wears a blue cloth coat that's frayed at the cuffs and hides what I am sure is a breathtaking figure. In her eyes, I can see certain yearnings that could easily be misunderstood by the wrong sort of man, as I'm sure I could see in your eyes, too, if I were with you and could look into them. On many mornings, I've thought of talking to her. I mean, saying something more than just good morning, which of course I say just out of politeness because that's the way I am, even if only to say chin up. But I've thought that I would sound like a man of the other sort who lounges on a street corner all day, when in fact I am a hard worker with a good job that I for one think is important to do, selling insurance. But it's sad work, because a man who sells insurance is always thinking about death. And so I say to you, chin up. Now you have a friend to correspond to. Please write to me soon and tell me something about your circumstances and also your youth and loveliness. Your new friend, John Simpson, Assistant District Manager. Dear Mr. John Simpson, oh, what a beautiful morning it is. Though the sky is gray and the wind whistles through the gaps around the door of the little hovel in which my unfortunate circumstances force me to live, for me the sun is shining, and I'm sitting in a modest but comfortable house, which is all I would ever want, since I don't need a castle or any of the trappings of wealth to make me happy. The sun shines for me because I'm holding your letter, which arrived this morning, and I knew even from the sound of the letter falling to the floor when the mailman pushed it through the slot that it was going to be a sunny day. And so I slipped out of the tub and went at once to pick it up, with only a small towel around me, which barely hid the gifts that nature has bestowed on me so generously that I blush to think of my reflection in the mirror on my closet door when I stand and look at myself in the candlelight for a while before I slip into bed. I lay in the tub for, I'm ashamed to admit, nearly an hour, reading and rereading your letter, John, and whispering your name, John, John, while I ran my sponge over myself in a transport of bliss. For me, your letter is the beginning of a new life. We will, I know, be the best and most constant of friends. I feel that we already are. You have been here with me in your wonderful letter for only a morning, and already I feel that I can tell you so much that I've never told another soul, including a little, just a little, of the painful story of lust and shame and betrayal that has made me a recluse, unwilling to show myself to the world, though not because of any disfigurement or lack of beauty, for it would be false modesty for me to say that I am not what the Daily News accidentally said I am, although, who knows, maybe some higher power made them make that mistake, to say what I could not have said myself, that I am, yes, lovely. There, I've said it, and I'm glad I've said it to you, though there are times when I wish that I were plain, because that very loveliness that should be a joy to me is a burden that you who are not a woman cannot know, though I think you can understand it from what you rightly said about that other sort. You'll think I'm odd, but when I began dressing, I put your letter under my pillow for modesty's sake. But then, while I was looking in my closet for something pretty to wear on this very special day, and choking back the tears because nothing there was suitable, I said to myself, oh, this is silly. I don't have to be ashamed in front of John. And so I propped your letter up on my dresser right in plain sight. Well, I never did find anything suitable to wear for you. Some of my things are torn by brutish, forceful hands, John, the hands of a forceful brute, hands that I still feel sometimes in terrible dreams, grabbing and tearing at my clothes, pawing me, grasping forcefully and brutishly at my... Not yet. Not yet. In time, I will be able to write everything for you. Everything. Everything. And you will lift some of the shame from me, somehow cleanse me of the oils left by his fingers when he touched me, maybe by using cotton balls and some witch hazel. But not yet. Not yet. If only I could afford to buy something very special to wear when I read your letters. Something clean, something that isn't stained by the past, something lovely like some silk underwear, which I could probably get for about $25. Oh, John, I've exhausted myself. There's high color in my cheeks from the joy of having you and the shame of the things I can't yet tell you. Write to me, write to me. Your grateful friend, Mary Strong. My dear Mary Strong, please do not be offended by the bills that flutter to the floor when you unfold this letter, possibly grazing your thigh or some other part of one of your lovely legs if you are in the state you were in when you opened my first letter, as I like to think you may be, or maybe settling on the plump big toe of one of your lovely small feet, if it does not offend you to have me say that, because even a nice guy like me likes to think about a pretty girl. I suppose you don't even remember that you let slip in your letter that you had nothing unsullied to wear when you read my letter, but you did, and my heart went out to you, and so I'm sending this trifle. I wish it were enough to allow you to dress yourself from head to toe, but since it is not, please allow me to counsel you to spend it on goods of the first quality that will last, and not to try to stretch it too thin and buy things that will not stand up under rough use. You mentioned silk underwear, but that seems like an extravagance to me, and perhaps a simple dress would be better, although I can understand that silk underwear would feel smooth and soft and fresh against your skin and would lift your spirits. So maybe you should get that after all. But as a woman, I'm sure you understand these things much better than I do, who am just a hard-working fellow who does not have much experience with women's underwear, if you know what I mean, and you aren't offended by my saying so. May I be bold and say that I feel more than just the feelings for you that any decent person would feel for an unfortunate young woman like yourself? When you hinted that some brute had been rough with you, my hands shook when I read what you hinted. If I had him here now, I shouted to my empty room. And when Mrs. Mitchell next door, whose story is a long and not very happy one, believe me, knocked on the wall, it brought me to my senses, and I realized that beating and kicking him and possibly hitting him on the head with a whiskey bottle that I had thought of doing wasn't going to change anything. And I ran from my room into the night where cold rain was falling and I wasn't even wearing a hat. And I walked along full of raging emotions as I walked, snarling at big lewd men, quite rough-looking fellows, and smiling with my throat choked up at gentle women like yourself. I walked all night, and when the sun came up, I still hadn't calmed myself, and somehow I found myself on the corner where Louise's coffee shop is, where I always get the bus to go to work, because I suppose our feet have a mind of their own. Sitting on the bench was the unfortunate woman in the cloth coat I wrote you about, and I admit that tears came to my eyes when I saw her. I walked right up to her and said, "Chin up, nobody lives forever," which was the first thing that came to my mind, because I guess I was thinking that I should really be getting to work, which is selling insurance, you remember, and that's one of our mottos in the office, not the chin up part, just the other part. When she looked at me, I could see in her eyes something sad or frightened, and I knew that I'd been right about how she was like you. I pulled a few bills from my wallet and pressed them into her hand. "Buy yourself some silk underwear," I said, "something clean and fresh." I walked off and didn't turn back, and I felt good and excited about what I'd done to bring a little joy into this vale of tears. Please let me know how the underwear fits, if that is what you decide to buy. With deep affection, Jack Simpson. Dear Jack Simpson, I'm blushing as I write this, because I'm already thinking of what I'm going to say. I'm sitting on the only comfortable chair I have. It's a wing chair, upholstered in pink, but it's worn at the arms and not as clean as it might be, because I got it for a good price at an auction long ago, when I used to go to such things. It's just big enough for me to curl up in. So I'm curled up in it now and writing this letter. I'm wearing your gifts, and that's all, even if I am a little chilly. Do you know what I mean? When I got home from the store, I was in quite a state. I'm sure that anyone who saw me hurrying along the sidewalk as fast as my shapely legs could carry me must have known that I had a secret. As soon as I was safely locked inside, I threw off all my old things and slowly pulled on my new you-know-whats, the thin, soft silk touching my skin so lightly. I let myself fall back onto the bed, and oh, John, I hope you won't think I'm criticizing you, but I feel so close to you right now, after what happened, and so I think I can say anything, and you will understand. And what I have to say, and please don't take this the wrong way, is this. Do you think you did the right thing talking to that woman that way? I'm sure I'm wrong, and she is probably a very nice woman who needs love and companionship just as much as I do. But I wonder what she can have in her mind if she sits on a bench like that, where men can see her with just a coat to cover herself, which I'm sure she leaves open on warm days, which we are starting to have some of now, crossing her legs too, I suppose. What can I say about a woman who would accept money from a man on the street? Be careful, John. Be careful. Oh dear, my leg has fallen asleep, and now I've got a cramp. I guess it's from being curled up in this chair too long. I should get a sofa, and then I could stretch out when I write to you, and I'd be able to write longer and more interesting letters. Well, dream on, dream on. Of course, my landlady did say that she had an old sofa that she would be willing to sell at a good price, maybe $12.50. And I'm sure that I could put a new cover on it, and maybe at the same time I could put a new cover on the chair to match. Well, someday, when I have about $32.80, or maybe if I sit on a bench in the rain, a man will run up to me out of nowhere, dragging a sofa and carrying some fabric. Yours faithfully, Mary Strong. Mary, dear Mary, you mustn't think for a moment that the woman I told you about, who waits for the bus, and whose name, by the way, turns out to be Eliza, which is a pretty name, I think, although many people think it sounds funny because it buzzes a little toward the end. You mustn't think that she's somehow bad, or that I meant to hurt you by telling you about her. I just wanted to show you that a person like me, who is handsome and good and quite virile, notices a woman, even if, let's say, she's just a typist waiting for a bus in the rain, and has probably thought of running up to her many times to say something to her, but may just be too shy or not good at making conversation unless it's about insurance. So you see, this is just one of my ways of saying, chin up. But I didn't quite tell you the whole truth, and so I will tell you now, because I don't want any untruthfulness to come between us and poison the waters, as so often happens between a man and a woman, as I have seen even in my own family. But that is another story. The truth is that Eliza works in the same office where I work, and the bus she waits for is the same bus that I wait for and ride to work, which is often quite a long ride because of the heavy traffic, so that a person usually arrives at work feeling a little queasy from spending a long time in an overheated bus that smells of a mixture of unpleasant things, and would like to take a shower right away if there were a shower in the office, which there is not. She certainly does have a breathtaking figure, but I know she is a good woman because of her modest demeanor, such as the way she looks down at her hands that she keeps modestly clasped in her lap when she smiles at me a little bit if I nod at her to say good morning or good evening, depending on whether we are riding to work or home from work at the end of the day. Sometimes I worry that she may think I am a conceited sort of fellow who does a lot of carousing and can't be bothered paying attention to the needs of a good woman because of the way that I just nod in the morning or the evening and don't make any conversation. Although I can't count the number of times I have thought of saying something to her and am just too shy, and I guess not good at making conversation unless it is about insurance, which is the only thing we ever talk about at the office. For example, Eliza, would you type up this letter to Mr. Flypaper, who hasn't paid the premiums on his full coverage policy with endowment at age 65 for 3 months? There isn't really anyone called Mr. Flypaper. At least I don't think there is. I just made that up to make you laugh. Although some of the names of people who take out insurance are very funny in real life, like Binker or Foot or Sandstone, which makes me giggle every time I think of it because it's a kind of rock. Besides, the things I told you about it in my last letter didn't really happen. I was just thinking about how they might happen, and so I wrote them down. Here is $32.80, and I hope the 80 cents didn't fall out of the envelope and hurt your cute foot. Please use the money to get the sofa that your landlady wants to sell, but act as if you think that it isn't a very good sofa and that it will take a lot of work and extra money to make it something that you would want to sit on, because you can always get something like that for a cheaper price if you pretend that you don't really want it. And then you will have a little more to spend on the fabric. And it is always a good idea to buy the best when it comes to cloth, so that it will wear well under hard use. With deepest affection, Jack. Dear Jack, I have started this letter so many times and thrown away the starts that didn't work out after crumpling them up into tight little balls that I finally decided to just start writing and keep on writing, no matter how it sounded or how it came out. So I hope that nothing I say will offend you, because I am just going to keep right on writing and say what is in my heart. I am so confused after reading your last letter over and over. Sometimes I think that you want to have 2 women who are your very good friends. And sometimes I think that you are only making up this Eliza so that I won't think that you're not a man of the world. And sometimes I think that you just want me to be your little pen pal who will listen to your exploits with a woman who is not just someone who writes letters to you and who is lying on a second-hand sofa reading a piece of paper, but is there in the flesh, if you know what I mean. If it is the first that you want, to have 2 women whose hearts beat faster when they say your name, then that is okay with me, because I can understand that a man like you, with a large heart, can have many friends, and I am willing to go along with what you want. But maybe that is not what you want. If it is the second, that you are only making up this Eliza so that I will know that you can make a woman's heart beat faster, then you can be sure that I understand. But you must know that you don't have to pretend with me, because my heart beats faster every time one of your letters arrives. But if you do want to pretend, why don't you pretend about me instead of Eliza, which I think is a pretty name, too, by the way. And maybe when you pretend about being with me, you would like to call me Eliza, which I wouldn't mind if that is what you want. But then again, maybe that is not what you want either. If you want the third thing, to write to me about certain exploits that you like to write about, I have to make a confession to you that my heart beats faster and a little tingle runs all through me when you write about Eliza, and I think of you close to her if you are in the office and talking to her about a letter or a policy, or maybe you accidentally brush against her when you are looking over her shoulder at what she has typed. And it could be that her blouse is not fully buttoned. Who knows? So if you want me to listen to what happens with Eliza, it is all right with me, Jack. Meanwhile, something has happened to the heat here in my tiny hovel, which is so much prettier now with the sofa that I can never thank you enough for, and I wish you were here so that I could try with all my might to thank you enough for it. I should have spent the money you sent me on the oil bills that I haven't been able to pay because of my unfortunate circumstances, but I was just like a little girl and got the sofa, which was more like getting a present for my birthday, which is next week. Ever since I was a little girl, I have had a tradition of spending my whole birthday in my birthday suit. And I wish I could do it this year and write you a long letter all about it. But I guess I won't be able to keep this tradition alive after they shut the heat off because of the overdue bills, which come to around $21. And even though we are having some warm days, there is a chill here that won't go away. Oh well, I've said what was in my heart, and now I will just send this letter off, and whatever you think is what you will think. But before I seal this letter, I will kiss it once and let it rest a while where I cannot say. And then I will heat up some soup, which will help me feel warm, and then crawl into my bed. With love, Mary. Dear Mary, I must tell you what has happened, and you must listen to me and be happy for me because I have no one else to tell. Eliza spoke to me, and not about insurance. Wasn't I surprised and pleased that she somehow knew that I had not been speaking to her much on the bus that we both happened to ride to work or at the end of the day home from work, just because I was too modest and shy, even though I don't give that appearance if you look at me, because I wear my hat at a jaunty angle and look like someone who has a good line with the ladies, even though I am not. Well, here's how it happened. When I saw Eliza at the bus stop, I touched the brim of my hat and said, "Good morning," which is my custom to say out of politeness and because I'm too nervous when I see her to say much else. And so she said, "Good morning," back, and though I didn't show it, my heart sank because I thought I knew that today would be like all the others, and I wouldn't say anything more to her. And then we got onto the bus. There we were on the bus and having to stand up, holding on, when a car suddenly shot out of a side street in front of the bus, and the driver shouted something that I pretended not to understand. When the bus driver slammed on the brakes, all of us on the bus were thrown this way and that, and as luck would have it, Eliza was thrown against my chest, which is hard and broad from the exercises I do every morning and the swimming I love to do in the summer at the beach, where I laugh a lot and wear a big grin and a good tan and have to brush my hair back often because it falls down over my forehead when the wind blows it, just like a schoolboy who might be the captain of the football team. Without thinking of what I was doing, I threw my strong arm around her waist to stop her from falling, and she said, "Oh, I'm sorry." And she looked up at me, blushing, and then quickly looked down out of her modesty, which is one of the qualities that I think is best. Do you know how people do crazy things if they are a little shaken up when a bus driver slams on the brakes and a young woman that they have wanted to talk to for a long time, with quite a nice figure, is thrown against them? They don't know what they are doing and feel just like a schoolboy? Well, that is just what happened to me. Instead of letting her go, my arm had a mind of its own and held her more tightly, and I blurted out, "Why, I'm not sorry at all, Miss Foote," bending down to blurt it out softly right into her ear so that at least no one else heard it. Oh, why did I say such a thing? Do you think she will take it in the wrong way? Later, I was thinking about it, and I thought that maybe she would be thinking about it too, and if she was, she might be wondering why a guy like me would say something like that, which is an awful lot like what the wrong sort of guy would say. I don't want her to get the wrong idea, because then everything would be spoiled after I finally said something to her. I think she will figure out that I was just in a muddle and blurted out something that I might have heard someone else say. What do you think? Please write and let me know what you think. But try to slow down when you write and be calm, because I was a little confused by your last letter. Don't take this in the wrong way, but I know that some people find that if they have a little glass of bourbon while they write a letter, it helps them calm down. Here's some money. For goodness sake, pay your oil bills. You can catch pneumonia if you run around in a cold apartment without any clothes on, as I have learned from bitter experience. Your dear friend, Jack. Dear Jack, how very lucky Miss Foote was that reckless driver pulled out in front of the bus that you ride to and from work. I guess some people have all the luck and have a good job and are not forced by shame that isn't really any of their fault to live alone in wretched circumstances and have a nice warm coat to wear when they are flirting with strangers while they sit with their legs crossed on street corners. And then fate smiles on them again and sends an impetuous lad careening out of a side street very conveniently at just the right moment so that they are thrown into the arms of a man like you, when they just happen very conveniently to be standing side by side. Oh, dear foolish Jack, open your eyes. Can all this have been just coincidence? Think about it. Is the bus that you ride always so crowded that you and little Miss Foot have to stand side by side, so close that she can accidentally brush her hip, or perhaps her thigh, or who knows what, against your leg, or perhaps who knows what? Has a car ever just happened to pull out in front of the bus before? Has the bus driver ever had to slam on his brakes at just the right moment so that the very fortunate Miss Foot is forced to throw herself against your manly chest before? Ha, I say, as I said when I read your letter. You can be sure, Jack, that if a woman has enough money to spend, and God only knows where or how she earns this money, because certainly she does not earn that much on a typist's salary, but there are ways for a woman to make money in her spare time. She can find plenty of people who will crowd onto a bus for a price, and a boy who can borrow his father's car will do anything to earn $1. Or perhaps a woman who is desperate can find an easier way to pay him, since young boys are always breathing heavily and almost drooling whenever I happen to see any of them walking by if I pull back the curtain to see what is going on in the world. Everybody knows that a bus driver who is probably of foreign extraction and has a huge family would drive his bus from here to California if you pressed a little folding money into his hand. Oh, Jack, please listen to someone who knows a bit about the world through bitter experience and who loves you very much, although we have not known each other that long. Do not do anything that you will regret. Oh, how I wish I could tell you these things in person and throw myself against you to demonstrate how such a thing can be made to look like an accident. Beware, Jack, beware. Think of your future at the insurance office and how you probably have a good shot at becoming district manager, but how all that would be tossed away by a breath of scandal if you commit an indiscretion for a moment's pleasure. Yours in hope and fear and tears, Mary. P.S. I almost forgot to ask you, do you think you could send me $20? If you could, then I could help out an old widow who lives just down the street and is an artist. I have been posing for her for some very beautiful drawings that she does in pen and ink. And if you would send $20, I would buy some of those drawings from her and send them to you. And then you would be able to see your faithful friend wearing the gifts that you bought her and even stretched out on her second-hand sofa in a very artistic pose, wearing only the gifts that nature has bestowed upon her so generously. Mary. My dear Mary, I hardly know what to say to you. Your last letter shocked me and disappointed me and made me wonder and also worry. I wonder if being alone and always wrapped up in just your own thoughts and unfortunate circumstances hasn't made you see things in a way that is a little bit out of whack. First, you are completely, utterly, terribly wrong about Eliza. She is a good and modest woman, and if she wants the affection of an honest and decent man, what of it? Would you begrudge her a little happiness just because you are miserable? Isn't that rather selfish of you, if you really sit down and think about it? What do you want her to do? Just keep banging away at the keys in the insurance office and reading the newspaper and drinking alone in her room? Is that fair, while some people are out dancing and eating in restaurants? I will tell you the truth. I feel that I must. I don't care whether it was by accident or by some plan that we were thrown together on that bus. I'm glad it happened, and I'm glad no matter why it happened. And I'll tell you something more. If I saw her at the bus stop tomorrow, and she had her hair down instead of up in the modest way she wears it, and she struck up a conversation with me on the bus and just happened to brush against me a few times, and then in the office took off her coat and accidentally a button or two of her blouse had come undone, or perhaps she had forgotten to button them in her hurry to get to work on time, so what? So what? I wouldn't mind it a bit, not a bit. And there is no telling what I would do. I might say, Eliza, Miss Foote, would you come home with me this evening to have dinner and meet my parents? I just might, because a good man has yearnings too. Don't you realize that? And not just yearnings, even desires that are perfectly normal when you get right down to it. And sometimes those yearnings and desires can be a good thing if they loosen his tongue that is tied in a knot by shyness. Maybe a woman has to do something. Maybe that is all I am waiting for. Something, some sign that might just be another accident or might be on purpose. Who knows? Mary, dear Mary, I owe this all to you. For if I do not do something, then won't I end up like you, sitting in my room and peering out the curtain at boys with their reckless ways and smooth cheeks and nice smiles, and writing to strangers through the mail? I am sending the $20 that you asked for, but I do not want you to send me those pictures that the poor widow drew. Buy the pictures from that widow and destroy them by ripping them up into tiny pieces or burning them in a wastebasket, if it is made of metal and will not start a dangerous fire. That is my advice to you. You should not offer to send such pictures to a man who corresponds to you, for what do you really know about him? Maybe he is just saying things to you that are not true, and is just giving you a good line in his letters, and he would not look at those pictures like something in a museum. How do you know? Perhaps we should not go on in this way, writing to each other. Maybe you should stop hiding yourself away in a little room at night and drinking bourbon by yourself that leaves a sour taste and makes your head ache. Why don't you do something? You have that nice underwear. Why don't you put it on and maybe one of those old things that got a little mussed up by somebody in that unfortunate past that you sometimes mention? But who knows? Maybe it is all in the way you look at it. Why don't you go outside and walk in the sun? Why don't you get a job? Your friend, Jack. Oh, Jack, my Jack. Don't be a blind, you dear sweet fool. Can't you see that this Eliza, if that's her real name, has only one thing in mind, and that is to get you in her clutches and then never let go? No. That is to dally, that is to toy with you for a little while and then drop you like a hot potato. Please, please promise me that you promise me, for the sake of all that we mean to each other, that you will stay away from her until you receive my next letter. Just give me time to pull my thoughts together so that I can help you come to your senses. No, just give me a day or two for the sake of all that we mean to each other. Will you promise me that? For my own snow, can't you just keep your hands off her until I have a chance to write you can't you just do without her, ignore her until I have a chance to write you a long and wonderful letter about this? I know that you must have a lot of love bottled up, pent up, festering, a lot of love seething inside you that you want to let out in the arms of some woman. But couldn't you just, oh, no, but will any woman do, just any woman? Couldn't you just hold out a little longer and maybe find some relief in self-abuse, in swimming, in daydreaming? Pretend that I'm there. Wrap your arms around your pillow. Whisper sweet, passionate things in my ear. Run your tongue, hold out, my darling. You can, you must. I'm working on the best letter ever. Oh, no, no. Dear, dear Jack, what good and wise advice you have given me. You have opened my eyes. You have lifted me out of the darkness and shown me how to live. I will live, how to live in the sunshine, how to live in the sunshine. I will do it. I will. Oh, but how can I? How can I get a job? How can I walk among decent people without a decent, modest dress? And now that I spent the $20 you sent me buying those shameful pictures, which made me blush with shame and embarrassment when I saw them, and thought that I was going to send them to you, to so good and kind a person as you, even though I was as innocent as Eve before she fell and caused all that trouble, when I thought of sending them to you, and didn't think how my innocence, which is really just like the innocence of a young girl who's never yet been penetrated yet, but no. I don't have any money to spend on a dress, not even one that isn't anything elaborate, but is just good enough to get a job. Could you send me another? So look, Jack, could you get me started in my new life with another $25? And then I'll be able to get a job, and you will have saved me, because there's no telling what I might do to myself if I can't get a job and follow your good and wise advice. No. My dearest Jack, my lusty Jack, my strong Jack, Jack honey, Jack, are you sure you wouldn't like to have a peek at those pictures? I bet that if you just took a look at one or two of them, your eyes would pop, and you'd say to yourself, you'd say, wow, what a knockout. This is something I can't pass up. I'm going to get the whole set. If you could just send me about $5, I'd be happy to pay the widow and send you a couple of them, and then you could be the judge. You could look at them in private and be the judge. Let me just describe one of them for you. There I am. I am stretched out. I am lying languidly on the sofa, just as naked as the day the sun through the window caressing my honey-colored body. One of my long, shapely legs lies stretched the length of the sofa, and the other is bent attractively at the knee. I'm looking right at you, Jack, and my eyelids with long lashes are drooping. I'm running my tongue, my wet pink tongue, over my lips, as if I were about to kiss you wetly, deeply, with abandon. My left hand, my one hand is resting on my right knee. And with my right hand, I am caressing my right, left breast. My other hand, left hand, right hand, left hand, has strayed down to the luxuriant, soft, light brown hair that grows, hides, frames, sets off, conceals. No! I was lying in my crib, picking at the fur on the back of my teddy bear's head. The shadows of the branches of the oak tree outside the window began to sway along the wall of my room, and I began to rock with them, slowly, then faster and faster, until they were hopping and jumping about in a blur, and my crib was shaking and creaking. I pulled myself up and looked outside to see what was upsetting the tree. I saw Mr. Beaker at his desk, not sitting at it, but squatting at it, pounding on it with both fists and hopping up and down. His gooseneck desk lamp leaped and bounced and shook from side to side in time with his hopping and pounding. He began sweeping paper off the desk in a fury. He seemed to have lost control of his gestures, to have become as graceless and unpredictable as I. I giggled and clapped my hands and said kitten, my favorite word among the words I knew, a new one that I understood from watching Gumma's kittens hop and tumble about as a verb, meaning hop and tumble about. Mr. Beaker's flailing grew wilder and wilder. He swept letters from his desk without regard to who had sent them, sweeping away those from Mary's many doting and generous correspondents, along with those from the difficult Jack Simpson. While he was sweeping the papers, on one of his sweeps to the left, he struck the desk lamp and hurt his finger. He drew in his breath. He held it. His cheeks puffed out, and his face reddened. He pounced on the lamp, seized it with both hands, and hurled it at the window. The lamp went through the window and hung by its cord, swinging against the side of the house, sending the shadows of the oak tree's branches into a mad frenzy. Mr. Beaker leaned across his desk and looked at what he'd done. I think he smiled. The shadow of his nose flipped from side to side as the lamp swung. My mother burst into my room to see if I was all right, scaring the bejesus out of me. I burst into tears and reached toward her. There, Peter, don't worry, she began. Then she caught sight of Mr. Beaker, leaning out his window, watching his desk lamp swing. Oh, Dudley, poor Dudley, what's wrong? She whispered. She scooped me up and carried me into the living room. Guppa had gotten his pistol out of his sock drawer. Gumma was wrestling with him at the front door, trying to keep him from making a fool of himself. My father kept poking his head out the door, glancing left and right, and pulling it back inside. It's Dudley, said my mother. Something's awfully wrong. One of those men he writes to has broken into his house, wailed Gumma. I knew this would happen. I always knew something like this would happen to me or somebody in my neighborhood someday. I can handle this, claimed Guppa. I'll go, said my father. He stepped back into the room. Where's my coat? It's gotten chilly since the sun went down, and there's a pretty stiff breeze. You're not going without me, said my mother. She held me a little tighter and started out the door. We moved slowly along the sidewalk in a tight group, watching Mr. Beaker's windows. I was leading, and my mother was right behind, carrying me. The lamp was still swinging, but slowly, and the shadows were settling down. When we reached the corner of Mr. Beaker's lot, his front door opened, spilling light onto the front walk. The little group shrank back into the shadows. Mr. Beaker stepped into the doorway and stood there, taking deep breaths. A shudder ran through us all. "Is he bleeding?" asked Guppa. Then Mr. Beaker flung the screen door open so hard that it banged against the side of the house. He spat a third of the way down the walk, turned away, and let the screen door slam shut. "Poor Dudley, something's awfully wrong," repeated my mother. She marched herself and me right up to the door, and she called through the screen, "Dudley? Dudley, are you all right?" There was no sound for a minute. Then we heard a toilet flush. Mr. Beaker came to the door, zipping his fly. His shirt wasn't well tucked into his pants, and his hair was a sight. "Ella," he said. "Ella." He shook himself and began arranging his hair. "Do you have a woman in here, Dudley?" my mother asked. She hoisted me up and held me tighter still. "What?" Mr. Beaker pushed at his shirt, stuffing it into his trousers. "A woman?" He smiled and raised an eyebrow. The left, I think. "What makes you ask?" He chucked me under the chin, brushing the back of his hand along my mother's cheek on the way. "We're coming in," shouted Guppa. Mr. Beaker pulled his hand away and took a step back. My mother and I turned toward the front walk. Guppa, and my father were standing on the steps in the light, bobbing this way and that to see if anyone was hiding behind Mr. Beaker. "What's going on?" asked Mr. Beaker. "Oh," he said, reaching for the door. "The noise. Sorry. I don't know what came over me. I guess I've been working too hard. He flung himself against the door jamb, leaning his forehead on his forearm. He began shaking his head. "He's getting away from me. I don't know what to do. I've tried. God knows I've tried, but I just can't do anything with him. I don't know what he wants anymore." "Who? Where is he?" demanded Guppa, waving the pistol and poking his head into the room. "Jack Simpson," moaned Mr. Beaker. My very first, and now I'm going to lose him. I just know I'm going to lose him." "You mean there's nobody here?" asked my father. "Of course there's nobody here," said my mother. She looked around, and then she stepped back and looked down the hall toward the bedrooms. "There's nobody here, is there, Dudley?" "No." "There's nobody here," called Guppa, turning toward Gumma, who was still on the steps. "Dudley is just having some trouble with that Jack Simpson, one of those lonely men he writes letters to." "I know," said Gumma. "He was the first one. I remember that day when Dudley came into the kitchen, dangling Mr. Simpson's letter like a little fish." "Dudley," my father said, smiling and knocking Mr. Beaker on the shoulder with his fist. "You know what you need? You need a drink." "Now, don't try to sell anyone a car, Herb," said Gumma. The group was making its way across the clamshell parking lot behind Whitey's Tavern. "The last time Herb and I were here," she said, turning toward Mr. Beaker, who might possibly not have heard the story, "Herb tried to sell Whitey a car, and he—" "It wasn't the last time, Lorna," Guppa corrected her. "It was a long time ago. Everybody but you has forgotten it. It was so long ago." "Well, it couldn't have been that long ago, because I remember it as if it happened yesterday," asserted Gumma. "It was before Whitey bought that jukebox," said Guppa, the hint of a whine in his voice. "That's why he didn't buy the car, because he wanted to buy that jukebox and liven the place up, remember? What he said to me was, 'What am I going to do, Herb? Park my Studebaker in the bar room? I've got to think of the business. Now look at this.' And he brought out that brochure about the jukebox. I remember it perfectly." "Wait till you see this jukebox," my mother said to Dudley, starry-eyed. "It's real clever. It has these two peacocks on the front." "Oh, of course," said Mr. Beaker. This struck me at once as a nasty remark, a dismissal, and I held it against Mr. Beaker for a long time, for years, in fact. To his credit, he regretted it immediately and told my mother so. "I'm sorry, Ella," he said. "I didn't mean to belittle your pleasure in the jukebox that way. Or rather, I did mean to belittle it in that way, but I regret it very much. You'll have to make allowances for my troubled state of mind. I'm afraid I gave in to the childish and self-centered idea that the gloom that envelops me should envelop you too, and that you should not be able to escape it by thinking of a jukebox, since I couldn't." "It's all right, Dudley," said my mother, touching him quickly on the arm. "I know you're worried and upset, and I think you've been doing a little drinking." Mr. Beaker smiled indulgently at my mother. "Thank you, Ella," he said, "but the explanation for what I said isn't that simple. Let me try to explain it again. Behind my remark there lurked the ignoble desire to make my companions share my suffering and unhappiness, don't you see?" He threw one arm across my father's shoulders and the other across my mother's, knocking me on the ear as he did so. The shameful desire to fill the hearts of one's good friends with the same anguish and misery that fills one's own heart, so that when they say, "We know how you feel," it will be the honest truth. That, he pronounced, is what we mean by commiserating. I began to whimper and rub my ear, but no one noticed. I don't know," said my mother. I guess so, but anyway, you'll like this jukebox, Dudley. There are lights that shine through the peacocks, and they change colors." "Yes, I'm sure I'll enjoy it," said Mr. Beaker. For a moment it seemed that he would say nothing more, and my mother seemed relieved. Then, almost reluctantly, he asked, "Do you know how that effect is achieved?" "No," said my mother dreamily. "It's real mysterious." "Not really," said Mr. Beaker, driven by a force that he could not control. "Two discs of glass, or perhaps acetate, I'm not certain about that, are scribed with tiny parallel lines. These discs spin behind the peacocks and in front of ordinary light bulbs. Because of the lines scribed in them, the discs act as prisms, analyzing the white light from the bulbs into the spectrum of colors. As they spin, of course, they produce combinations of light in what seems to be an unpredictable pattern, an endless variety of moving colored lights, but is actually, I would think, repetitious, a cycle with a long period, so that the viewer, who is probably distracted now and then by other things in the barroom, doesn't notice the pattern." "It's real mysterious," said my mother, with little conviction, straightening my collar. "Have you been here before, Dudley?" asked my father. "Never," said Mr. Beaker, surprised by the question. After a moment, when he realized why my father had asked, he added, "There are other jukeboxes like this one, Bert." My father narrowed his eyes. "I know," he said. "I just wondered if you had ever been here." "Anyway, it wasn't Whitey, Lorna," Guppa corrected her, raising his voice. "It was his boy, Chester." "He means Porky," said my mother. She giggled. "Well, it doesn't matter much which one, really," said Gumma, "but what happened was that Whitey decided that he had heard all he ever wanted to hear about Studebakers, so he—" "Are you going to enter this establishment, Lorna?" asked Guppa, holding the door open and bowing. "Oh, stop interrupting, Herb. You just don't want me to tell Dudley how Whitey started—" "Whoa!" called Whitey from behind the bar. "Hide your money, folks. Here comes Herb Studebaker." calling you Herb Studebaker. Isn't he a sketch? Guppa put on a smile and strode into Whitey's, pounding friends on the back, friends who slapped their hands over their wallets in mock terror. Now, don't feel uncomfortable just because everyone's looking at you, Dudley, said my mother. It's just that they don't know you, and they don't see that many people in here that they don't know. And isn't that my problem? Asked Mr. Beaker. He sighed a long sigh, an invitation to commiseration. I just don't know this Jack Simpson. It's not really the same thing, said my father. Oh? Asked Mr. Beaker. Don't these people know you? When they see you walk through the door, don't they say to themselves, ah, it's Bert Leroy. I know what to expect from him. I don't have to worry. Oh, sure, said my father. Ella and I come here pretty often. I would say regularly, said Whitey, grinning across the bar. You see, said Mr. Beaker, that's my point. Well, it depends, said my father, responding to Whitey. I would say regularly on Sunday afternoons. And often on Friday nights, asserted Whitey. Oh, no, May Castle corrected him. Frequently on Friday nights. She turned on her stool and crossed her legs. She smiled at my father and then at Mr. Beaker, waiting for an introduction. Well, yeah, said my father. He chuckled. Frequently on Friday nights. And on Saturday nights, added my mother, inserting me between May and Mr. Beaker and setting me on the bar. No, Ella, scoffed May, giving my mother a playful push. You're not here frequently on Saturday nights. I'm always here on Saturday nights, and I frequently don't see you here. You're only here sometimes. Now you, she reached around my mother and patted Mr. Beaker on the shoulder, you're never here. That is, you've never been here before. I'm May Castle. I, said Mr. Beaker, am someone you know nothing about. I am a stranger, a mystery. I'm Dudley Beaker. Oh, you are. May gave my mother a look. Are you going to buy me a beer? My mother asked my father. I've heard your name, Dudley, said May. She looked at my mother again. Frequently. My father whispered in Mr. Beaker's ear. Her husband disappeared about a year ago. No, it must be 2 years. As soon as people started noticing that he wasn't around, May started saying that he had passed away on a business trip, and she's been playing the Merry Widow ever since. You could do worse, Dudley. Mr. Beaker turned toward my father with his eyes wide and his mouth open. Listen, Bert, he said, I came here to talk. May tugged on his sleeve from the other side. Come here a minute, Dudley, she said. Did you dress yourself, honey? Your mommy must be on vacation. You're a mess. She began straightening his tie and smoothing his hair. Mr. Beaker looked uneasily around the barroom. He couldn't find the door. So, said Whitey, you people going to drink something, or do you just want to rent these stools? May pushed her glass toward Whitey, and Whitey began drawing beer for my parents. I'll have a scotch, said Mr. Beaker, with a little water. My father raised his eyebrows. May had improved Mr. Beaker's hair and tightened his tie. She smoothed his shirt and tucked it into his slacks a little better. Then she gave his pants a hike and tugged at his lapels to straighten his jacket, tipping him toward her. You don't look happy, stranger, said May, brushing at Mr. Beaker's shoulders. You look like a man with a problem. He is, said my father, smiling. Uh-oh, said Whitey. What did you do, buy a car from Herb? Yes, but that has nothing to do with it. I'm quite satisfied with the car, said Mr. Beaker. Dudley's having trouble writing a letter, said my father, nodding and acting mysterious. Ho, ho, said Whitey. That's something I stay far away from. Letters can get you into a lot of trouble. My father always told me, don't write anything down. He called the words across the room so that Porky, who was refilling bowls of pretzels, would hear them, and so that everyone else in the room would hear them too. It was an old joke, but it got the old laugh, which was all Whitey wanted. Porky blushed. He was having so little success in getting his hands on the girls at Babington High that he couldn't imagine what he might write down that could get him into trouble. But every time his father made the joke, Porky blushed, and that convinced Whitey that his son was enjoying youth to a degree that he had not. I just don't understand this Simpson, complained Mr. Beaker, shaking his head, looking to either side of him to see who was listening. He swallowed the last of his scotch. My father immediately signaled Whitey to bring him another, which Mr. Beaker began drinking without noticing that it was a new drink. You tell me about it, said May. Mr. Beaker began fiddling with his pipe, poking and pounding at the tobacco with a complicated brass tool that my father suspected was a prop, something that Beaker used only when he had an audience. At home, my father knew, from standing on his toes and looking into Mr. Beaker's kitchen, he smoked mentholated cigarettes and lit them with ordinary paper matches. My father passed his hand over his mouth, but his eyes were bright above it, and I could tell he was grinning. At first, said Mr. Beaker, leaning toward May and holding up his index finger, I thought I knew what he was after. I figured that he wanted a little flattery, a little titillation. Whitey raised both eyebrows, as my father had done earlier. I tried it myself. This is a family bar, he said. You have to watch what you say here. I assure you, said Mr. Beaker, that I do not intend to say anything that will upset the hard-working folk who gather here to drink away the memory of each working day. I wouldn't exactly say that, said Whitey. I mean, most of the people you see here tonight only come in on the weekends. I grant you we get a different crowd during the week, but I don't know that I'd call them hard-working. I wonder whether Simpson goes to bars, Mr. Beaker wondered aloud. What's the name? Asked Whitey. Mr. Beaker took from his pocket a brass lighter, a miniature reproduction of the sort of torch used in those days to solder copper pipe. At the back, above the little handle, was a lever that could be pumped to raise the pressure in the fuel container. From the top, a nozzle projected horizontally, terminating in a perforated sleeve, and just in front of this sleeve was a striking wheel that, when spun, produced a spark from a flint held just below the wheel in a cylindrical flint holder. When a valve was opened, fuel was forced through the tiny nozzle under pressure, and the atomized fuel rushed through the sleeve, where it mixed with air drawn into the sleeve through the perforations. This air and fuel mixture was ignited by the spark and produced, with a miniature roar, a flame as long as Mr. Beaker's index finger, a flame that Mr. Beaker could count on to capture the attention of everyone nearby. He pumped the lighter several times, opened the valve, and spun the striker, producing the desired results. Jack Simpson, he announced. That's the guy he's having all this trouble writing a letter to, said my father. He doesn't come in here, said Whitey. What's the name? Asked May. Simpson, said Whitey. Jack Simpson. What does he look like? May pushed her glass toward Whitey and twisted on her stool so that she faced Mr. Beaker and her knee just touched his leg. Mr. Beaker looked at her for a long time before answering. What does he look like? I don't know. I've never seen him. Oh, I thought you knew him. I thought I knew him too. Mr. Beaker shook his head slowly from side to side. He rubbed his forehead with his fingers as if he were massaging away a pain. I even thought I knew what he looked like. I would have said a while ago that he was short, balding, and a little overweight, that he had in his closet a hat with a feather, a hat he had bought after a long period of hesitation, a hat that he had imagined wearing at a jaunty angle when he went to work in the morning, a hat that he had never had the nerve to wear. "Oh, I know that guy," said May. She held a cigarette to her lips and leaned toward Mr. Beaker for a light. She lost her balance on the stool and had to steady herself with a hand on his shoulder. "I think my husband, who died, used to know him." Mr. Beaker sighed through his nose and lit May's cigarette with a match from a book on the bar. "I'm not describing him as he is, only as I imagined him to be," he explained. My father signaled to Whitey again. "Wait a minute," said Whitey. "Let me get this straight. Are we talking about somebody you just made up?" "If I had made him up," said Mr. Beaker, "I would not have made him so—" He paused, unable to find not only the right word, but any word that would fit reasonably well. He looked at May, who was waiting for him to finish the thought, and at Whitey and my father, also waiting. Then he looked at his drink. "Hard to describe," suggested May. "Bald?" asked my father. "Fat," said Whitey. "Mysterious?" asked my mother. "Hard to control," said Mr. Beaker. My father saw the opportunity that he had been waiting for. His hand shook when he raised his glass, and he spilled a little beer on the bar, but he succeeded fairly well in making himself sound as if a small and inconsequential idea had just occurred to him. "It seems to me," he said, "that your real problem isn't Jack Simpson. It's this woman he has his eye on, this, what's her name? Eliza. Yeah, see, with this Simpson, you've got a problem you don't have with those others." "He writes to other men too?" May asked my mother. "You've got competition. Now see, you should be thinking about how you're going to match the competition." "You're competing with some woman for the attentions of this guy who wears a hat with a feather?" asked May. She drew away from Mr. Beaker. "It's business, May," said my mother, reaching between May and Mr. Beaker again to move the pretzel dish away from me and slide her glass toward Whitey. "It sounds like funny business to me," said May. She reached around my mother and gave Mr. Beaker a little push on the shoulder. "Is that what you're up to? Funny business?" "If I were you, Beaker," my father continued, "I'd get a look at this Eliza and see what I was up against. Then I'd know what to do. Maybe she isn't really any competition at all." "Sure," said my mother, "that could be. Remember how jealous you used to be of—" "I wasn't ever jealous," said my father, snapping his head toward my mother. "Bert," said Mr. Beaker, "you've got it." My father's jaw dropped, but he recovered quickly. "Sure," he said. "This Eliza may be some dumpy, dull-witted—" "No, no, no," said Mr. Beaker. "You've got it, but you don't know it. Eliza is quite wonderful. She's modest, selfless, and quite nice-looking, but she's no competition at all." Mr. Beaker leaned toward Whitey and finished in a stage whisper that fell across the bar like a heavy drizzle. "Because she isn't. She is not. There is no Eliza Foote at all. I've let myself get all upset over nothing, something my mother always cautioned me against." He smiled and pushed his glass toward Whitey with more vigor than he had intended. It slid across the bar and over the edge. Whitey snatched the glass out of the air and began refilling it. Mr. Beaker began chuckling. "That's Simpson," he said, "the wily devil. He doesn't want flattery and titillation. He wants competition, an epistolary battle of wits. Oh, he's a clever bastard. He introduced an unknown quantity, this Eliza, in order to wrest control of our correspondence from me. Next, he'll probably start asking for money. Now, what do I know about this feigned Eliza? She waits at a certain bus stop each morning, wearing a blue cloth coat. He leaned across the bar and asked Whitey, "Where is Louise's coffee shop?" "Louise's coffee shop? That's over on Bolotomy in Maine, isn't it?" suggested Whitey. No, said May. That's Lucille's pastry shop. They do have coffee, though I wouldn't eat the donuts there if I were you. Too heavy, greasy. Try Lucy's donuts. They make good donuts, but you have to get there early when they're fresh. "There's a Louise's sandwich shop. Where's that?" asked my mother. "That's closed," said my father, "long ago. We used to go there when we were in high school, remember?" Wait a minute, am I thinking of the right place? It wasn't Louise's sandwich shop. It was Louise's lunch, wasn't it? Whitey leafed through a telephone book. "Louise's," he said. "There's one in Hargrove." Hargrove. "Yes, that's right," said Mr. Beaker. "I'm off to Hargrove to see for myself that there is no Eliza Foote." He reached for his drink, then rejected it with a scowl and a wave. "Good night to all," he said. "Whitey, you run a very nice place here. Where is the door?" Mr. Beaker insisted on walking home alone through the rain that had begun to fall. At the door, he fumbled with the latch for a moment and then stepped into the night. That was a Friday night. I didn't see him again until the following Sunday, and only years later did I persuade him and Eliza to give me an account of what had happened in the meantime. We sat in their living room. Mr. Beaker was wearing a cardigan sweater with suede patches on the elbows. Eliza was wearing a gray silk suit. While we talked, Mr. Beaker smoked his pipe and Eliza smoked several cigarettes. Mr. Beaker drank half a tumbler of scotch. Eliza drank 2 martinis. "It was raining when I left the bar, Whitey's," said Mr. Beaker. "I welcomed the rain. It was cold, but it refreshed me. I didn't walk directly home, but wandered, and while I walked, I thought about Jack Simpson, about how Simpson had nearly felled me in our epistolary jousting, and I plotted ways to parry and thrust. As I walked, I grew fonder of Jack Simpson, as combatants can grow fond of worthy adversaries. I let myself project our correspondence into the future, imagining the pleasure of turning from answering the letters of Mary's other correspondents, who were already beginning to sound much alike, to dueling with Jack Simpson, as I might turn to a game of chess to clear and stimulate my mind. I was so pleased with the prospect of this long and intriguing combat that I found myself chuckling as I walked and smiling. So agitated was I that I walked for hours, stopping from time to time for shelter from the rain at several of the bars along the winding route that I took from Whitey's to No Bridge Road. In some of these, while I sipped a warming scotch, I felt the urge to talk and found myself muttering, "If only Jack were here now." At the last bar I visited, this muttering attracted the attention of another patron who thought me an unfortunate figure, a lonely drinker with no one but himself to talk to. This fellow tried to strike up a conversation, and his attempt made me think that he was a lonely fellow with a need to talk. I found myself going on for hours with a perfect stranger about things that I really knew nothing about. The ancient struggle to wrest the clam from the bottom of the bay, brother pitted against brother in the competition for choice beds, the best way of hiding tough old chowder clams in sacks of tender cherry stones. When the bar closed, I slapped this new friend on the back, shook hands heartily, and walked home. I was a little drunk, I think. All the way home, I berated myself for not having had the nerve to ask the fellow the one question I had about clams. Do they bite? I intended to slip inside my house quietly, but each of my limbs seemed to have developed a mind of its own, and I stumbled on the steps and then threw the screen door open with such force that it slammed against the side of the house. I remember that, I said. It woke me, and I stood up in my crib, rubbing my eyes. I watched lights turn on and off, and then your house was quiet again, and I went back to sleep. Early in the morning, I heard whistling, and when I looked out, I saw you closing your garage door, your Studebaker idling in the driveway. You got into the car and drove off. Meanwhile, said Eliza, I was at my wit's end. The night before, I had let myself be lured to the apartment of the fellow who had been the inspiration for Jack Simpson. I had, naively, thought him a dashing and clever guy, and he had, I admit, set my heart aflutter when he asked me to have dinner alone with him in his apartment instead of in a restaurant, because his apartment was so much cozier, and we would be able to talk together quietly. And of course, it would also be much cheaper for him, and he had to consider that since he was on a tight budget. Well, there we were in his apartment, and we hadn't been alone for 5 minutes when all of a sudden, his hands developed a mind of their own. 1 minute, he was a nice guy with a boyish smile and a nice conversation, even if he didn't really have much to say, except about how he was sure to be district manager pretty soon and how much money he would make, and a few nice things about how pretty my hair looked when it was down and how long my legs were. And then a few minutes later, he was all over me and tearing at my things with the hands of a forceful brute. I kept saying, no, no, in a strong voice, even if I couldn't really yell because it might have disturbed the neighbors who didn't know what was going on and might have caused a lot of trouble. And I said, no, but the more I said it, the more he thought I was turning on a green light. And I said, no, no, but he kept right on going and even kept right on going faster. And no, I said, no. And when, to my surprise, a little sound like a squeal jumped out of my mouth, he said, Jesus, honey, the neighbors, which is not a very romantic thing to say. And no, I said, no. And then before I knew it, it was all over. And it was a big disappointment, let me tell you. She stopped and lit a cigarette. She threw her head back and blew a long column of smoke toward the ceiling. She threw her arm along the back of the couch and crossed her legs, making the silk suit whisper. She turned toward me again and pursed her lips. I got a little carried away. Let me see. He fell asleep. I let myself out and walked home. The next day, I felt pretty good. And I looked at myself in the mirror, and my cheeks were bright, and I had a little spring in my step, so I didn't put my hair up. When I got to the bus stop, there he was, and did he ever look different? He was wearing a jacket that looked as if he had borrowed it from a gorilla or made it himself in his spare time, and I realized that he'd been wearing that jacket for months. He gave me a little wave and said good morning, and that was all. And I had been expecting some little secret smile, because even though I didn't have such a great time, he seemed to enjoy himself plenty. So something came over me, and I walked right up to him and stood on my toes and whispered in his ear as if I were whispering some sweet nothings. And he was looking around to see who noticed, and of course everybody did. And very sweetly I said, "You need practice." And right then I could have knocked him over with a feather. I could see the blood drain from his face, and I could tell that his knees got weak and rubbery because he shrank about an inch. And I sashayed over to the bench and took off my coat and crossed my legs and grinned. I left work early that afternoon. My mind was racing and all my typing was a mess. I went home and began sorting out my things. I didn't have any plan. I was just cleaning my slate. I didn't realize that I was talking so loudly to myself until Mrs. Mitchell, who lived next door, came over to see what was the matter. I told her. I began heaping old things of mine on her, and it was only when I came to the little white sunsuit that I had bought after a long period of hesitation, a sunsuit that I had imagined wearing to someone's summer house for the weekend, but had never worn at all, that I knew I wasn't just doing my spring cleaning. I was leaving. I got out my suitcases, and I threw in the sunsuit and the other things that I wanted to keep. I spent a fitful night, and when I got up in the morning, I got out of there as quickly as I could. Mr. Beaker let a moment pass to be certain that it was his turn to speak. "I found Louise's coffee shop easily," he said. "It was a popular spot in Hargrove at that time, God knows why. I parked on the street across from the place, waiting for Eliza not to appear. I grew more and more delighted at her failure to appear until I realized that no one at all had come to the corner to wait for the bus, that in fact no bus had stopped at the corner. And only then did I realize that this was a Saturday morning. I was disappointed, but not terribly disturbed. I was sure that I was right, that there was no Eliza Foote. I decided to make a few discreet inquiries at Louise's. I was just about to step out of the car when a woman, carrying 2 suitcases and a blue cloth coat, walked around the corner and sat on the bench, setting a suitcase on either side of her. You could have knocked me over with a feather. "I sat there on the bench," said Eliza, "enjoying the sun and the anticipation of something new. I glanced across the road and saw a fellow sitting in a Studebaker, staring at me with his mouth hanging open. 'Take a good look,' I said to myself, and I stretched out in the sun. Providentially, a warm breeze blew my skirt up a little. I glanced at him sidelong, and I could see that he was staring at me like mad. So I casually looked in his direction and acted as if I had just noticed him for the first time. I said good morning and smiled. I got out of the car in a trance," said Mr. Beaker. "I had no doubt who she was, but I had no idea what to do." He walked up to me slowly, his eyes fixed on mine, and he didn't say anything. He just stood there. Without thinking about it, really, I said to myself, I'm not going to give this guy my right name. So I smiled at him and said, "My name is Mary Strong," which was the first name that came to mind since it had been on my mind for so long. Mr. Beaker leaned forward and spoke rapidly. I understood it all in an instant. You must imagine as I relate my thoughts that only a second is passing, that if you had been at the corner, you would have seen no hesitation between Eliza's introducing herself and my introducing myself. I thought, my God, could that be? Could this merely be a coincidence? Oh, no, never. You're not Mary Strong, my dear. I am Mary Strong, and you can't be anyone but Eliza Foote. But how do you know Mary Strong? Has Jack been showing Mary's letters to you, sharing a laugh over her confusion? Or is there no one to share that laugh with you? No one but me? I held out my hand. I'm Jack Simpson, I said. Eliza put out her cigarette slowly, tapping at the ashes until nothing was left burning. The whole thing came to me in a flash, she said. All these ideas raced through my mind in the time it takes to blink your eyes. I thought, wow, could that be? Is this just a coincidence? Oh, no. You're not Jack Simpson. I made Jack Simpson up, so if anybody's Jack Simpson, I am. So who are you? Who knows about Jack Simpson? Just me and Mary Strong. I smiled and batted my lashes. I think we've got those backwards, I said. We shook hands, said Mr. Beaker. We walked over to the car, said Eliza. We drove off. We went to the beach. We walked on the sand. We talked. We laughed. It was nearly dark when we pulled into Dudley's driveway. Dudley didn't even put the car into the garage. He hustled me into the house. We made love, and it was, well, not bad. Let's say that I've suggested a few improvements since then. Matters of style, mostly. Mr. Beaker coughed and tamped his pipe. Quite a few, he admitted, and he grinned. I have suggested a few improvements in style myself. Style of dress, of speech, of mannerism. Eliza patted Mr. Beaker on the back of his hand. He fell asleep, she said. I unpacked and then poked around. I found the letters, of course, and spent a long time reading through them. I could see that he had real talent, but that there was room for improvement there, too. When I woke up, said Mr. Beaker, she was pulling on my ear and saying, Dudley, wake up. She hadn't a stitch on, and the sight of her as soon as I opened my eyes, well, it took my breath away. She was holding fistfuls of letters, and she insisted that we go through them immediately so that I could see the changes she had in mind. I said to him, admit it, Dudley, you've been botching up the sex parts. And as she went on, I had to admit that she was right. She had several improvements to suggest, and they were all quite interesting. I suggested that she work with me as my assistant. Nothing doing, I said. Partner or nothing. I could always write to these guys and tell them they've been duped. I thought of the way that I had come to anticipate with such relish the competition with Jack Simpson, the jousting, the thrust and parry, and I said to myself, why, here you have the creator of Jack Simpson, you fool. And I agreed. And he has never regretted it since, said Eliza. I've never been a religious man, said Mr. Beaker, slowly and carefully. But I've always had the conviction that a benevolent hand nudged each of us toward that corner that morning. What a beauty the next day was, the day my mother tumbled from her lawn chair. It was one of those late spring days that make one want to go on living. A June day that, confused, had blundered into April. Everyone slept late. In the afternoon, we were all on the front lawn. Guppa, and my parents were sitting in lawn chairs on the half of the lawn near Mr. Beaker's house. On the other half, separated from them by the front walk, I was chasing Gumma's cats 6 black kittens. When I caught one, I carried it, often by the tail, to my little red wagon, plopped it into the wagon, and went off after another. The kitten sniffed around in the wagon for a while, hopped out, and wandered away. I brought another kitten to the empty wagon, plopped it in, clapped my hands and giggled, and scrambled off after another. I was having a fine time. If my mother had not tumbled from her lawn chair, there is no telling how long I might have continued happily chasing those kittens without ever caring whether I got them all into the wagon at once. But the innocent and useless pursuits of childhood cannot last forever. When Mr. Beaker's front door opened, we all heard it. We stopped what we were doing, turned, and watched a leggy blonde in a white sunsuit start down the steps. Mr. Beaker followed her, grinning and saying something that I couldn't quite make out. We watched them every step of the way from his house to Gumma and Guppa's, for we knew that we were watching something important, a change, and that we were likely always to remember this day as the day that Mr. Beaker stepped out of his house with a blonde. The kittens soon stopped watching and went back to hopping and tumbling about, but I watched the introductions, which were a little stiff, Eliza holding back a bit until Mr. Beaker put a hand on her naties and nudged her forward. Guppa and my father hopped out of their chairs and offered them to Eliza, but she wanted to stand, and my father nearly said that if he had legs like that, he'd rather stand too, but he thought better of it and instead offered Dudley and Eliza a beer. Gumma pointed out the crescent of crocuses in a corner of the lawn. Everyone turned at once to look at them, and there were remarks about their beauty and the beauty of the day. When Eliza bent at the waist to look more closely at the crocuses, my mother looked away, turning toward me again. She looked as if she wanted me to get back to work chasing the kittens, so I did. "Oh, look, Dudley, isn't Peter cute?" cooed my mother. She twisted in her folding chair and reached for her iced tea. "Cute," said Gumma. She clapped her hands in just the way that I was clapping them and giggled just as I was giggling. I clapped and giggled back. "What he's doing is pretty damn stupid, if you ask me," said my father. "Like trying to carry water in a sieve, wouldn't you say, Dudley?" Mr. Beaker didn't answer, but he gave my father a look of interest and encouragement. "Why doesn't he see that he'll never get the kittens to stay in the wagon and just give up?" my father asked. "That's one of the big lessons in life, knowing when to quit." He took a long, bracing pull at his beer and glanced at my mother. "Kin," I said. "Kitten," said Guppa, aiming his box camera my way. "Kin," I said. "Kitten," said Mr. Beaker. "Kitten, kitten." "Oh, leave him alone, Dudley," whispered Eliza. "Smile, Peter. Say cheese," called Guppa. "Kin," I said. I clapped my hands and smiled into Guppa's camera. Reaching for her tea, but watching me, my mother bumped her hand against the metal folding table that held the tea and her cigarettes and ashtray. The table, poorly balanced on the uneven lawn, tipped away from her. She felt it move and glanced at it. She saw it tipping and knew at once that she would not be able to stop it. If she tried, she was likely to end up on the lawn herself, with her skirt halfway up her thighs and people fussing over her. With a frantic, desperate effort, my mother lunged for the table. My mother, her chair, and her table began to fall in an arc, as if the lawn had been a rug someone had yanked from under her. My mother was wearing a white skirt and blouse and a look of surprise. Her arms were thrown out to the side toward the falling table, and her legs were raised high in the air, flapping out of control. I could see the tops of her stockings and her garters and the pink flesh of her inner thighs. A glass of tea was in the air above the table, and beside it, drifting away from it, floated a clamshell ashtray under a cloud of ashes. I clapped and giggled again. Another kitten hopped out of the wagon. The table struck the lawn, its circular top resounding like a gong, flying off the base and rolling toward the street. "Ye gods and little kittens," shouted Gumma, clasping her hands over her heart. "Shit," expostulated my mother, reaching the lawn herself. My father and Mr. Beaker ran to my mother at once. Gumma and Guppa struggled out of their chairs and rushed over to help. The tea had ruined my mother's cigarettes and stained her skirt. Mr. Beaker gripped my mother in the left armpit and began helping my father haul her to her feet. Eliza ran into the street after the tabletop and was nearly struck by a passing Studebaker. At the sound of its squealing tires, Mr. Beaker turned, saw Eliza holding the dented tabletop, cried, "Oh, God, no," and let go of my mother to run to Eliza, leaving my father struggling with my mother on his own. When he got her to her feet and satisfied himself that she'd suffered no serious harm, he too dashed out to the street to see if Eliza was all right. My mother stood still for a moment, looking into the street, where my father and Mr. Beaker were checking Eliza's legs for scratches. There were none. Finally, my mother made her way toward the house on her own, clucking at herself and brushing at her skirt. "I don't know what came over me," my mother said aloud. "I knew that I didn't have a chance of saving the table, but I just had to try." She stopped at the front door and turned toward the street again, where my father and Mr. Beaker were still fussing over Eliza. "I didn't have a chance," she said. "I don't know what came over me." She went inside. Mr. Beaker, Eliza, and my father stood together, laughing nervously. Gumma and Guppa were straightening up the mess my mother had made. "I think we could all use a drink," said my father. He began opening bottles. When they each had one, they clinked them together, and my father said to Eliza, "Well, at least you won't forget this day." "You know, Bert," said Mr. Beaker, "I think you're almost right about Peter and the kittens, but not quite." "Oh, yeah?" growled my father. "Dudley," said Eliza. Mr. Beaker nodded in my direction. "It's not a matter of foolish persistence in pursuing an impossible goal. It's a matter of focusing the attention." He raised his voice. "True genius," it has been said, "lies in the art of focusing the attention." He paused to let that sink in, and Eliza took advantage of the pause at once. "I don't know about that," she said. "It seems to me that a true genius ought to be able to keep a lot of balls in the air at once." There was a pregnant silence. Gumma, Guppa, and my father stood still, unbreathing. The kittens and I stopped romping. We all looked at Mr. Beaker. No, he said. "You have an example right in front of you." He pointed his pipe stem at me. "Now, if little Peter there were to narrow his focus, concentrate on and pursue only one kitten, he could catch it and keep it. You know what we're seeing here, Bertram?" My father looked at Mr. Beaker over his glasses, raising his eyebrows to say, "What? Go on, I'm listening." Mr. Beaker began poking and tamping at his pipe. "What, Dudley?" asked Eliza. Mr. Beaker tamped and poked until he had put the fire out. He put the pipe tool into his pocket and bent over and began knocking the pipe on the heel of his shoe. When he had finished knocking it, he began refilling it. My father was growing annoyed. "Damn it, Beaker, what?" he demanded. Mr. Beaker brought out his lighter, pumped it several times, and spun the striker. My father clenched his teeth. "Get to the point, Beaker," he cried. While Mr. Beaker directed the flame into his pipe, he looked at my father as if he hadn't heard him, raising an eyebrow as if he were surprised that my father hadn't figured out what he was talking about. He pointed at me with his pipe stem. "Remember this scene," he said. "Here we see Peter's life in miniature. This pursuing now one notion or kitten, now another, this inability to concentrate entirely on one thing or kitten for fear that the others will get away, though really he might just as well pursue any one of them as all of them, for the kittens, as you and I can see at a glance, are so like one another as to be indistinguishable, each just a variation on the theme black kitten." He chuckled and jotted something in a little leather-covered notebook. "Do you follow me?" he asked. My father turned toward me again. I dropped a kitten into the wagon, clapped my hands, and giggled. The kitten hopped out, and my father frowned. I looked at Eliza, and she looked at me. Then she walked across the front walk onto my side of the lawn and began snatching up kittens. She caught 5, and I caught 1, and we plopped them all into the wagon at once. Then she picked me up and held me on her hip. The sun was still weak, and it was late in the afternoon now, and a little chilly, so she may have hugged me so tightly, only for warmth. The next audiobook in the series is part 2 of Little Follies, Do Clams Bite?, in which Peter Leroy considers the origins of his childhood pelecypodophobia, the fear of bivalve mollusks, meets the imaginary friend who will remain his best friend for life, memorizes the legends of his ancestors in the Leroy line, including Black Jacques Leroy, who invented beer, studies his father's nude photographs of family friend May Castle, and enjoys a moonlight swim with Margot and Martha, the Glynn twins, after which he concludes that clams do not bite.